So this session is about managing developer credits, issues and alternatives. And kind of the idea here is I wanted to bring together some local impact fee, local government impact fee folks who had experience with different systems, that had different systems, as ways to illustrate how they can be different. And hopefully we've got kind of a mix here. So our other speaker, I'm Clancy Mullen with Duncan Associates. I'm a consultant, so I don't actually have a lot of experience in what it takes to track all this stuff. You know, the sort of day-to-day things people have to do when you have developer credits. And particularly with road fees, you tend to have a lot of these. Kind of the part that, you know, you get the impact fee, but you got to track all these developer credits because some developers you're going to want right away from, et cetera, et cetera. I would like to introduce our other speakers. We have one, unfortunately, could not make it from Washoe Regional Transportation Commission in Nevada. But we have Holly Osborne on the end there from Surprise, Arizona. Then we have Chris Dawson from Alachua County, Florida, and David Goldstein from Pasco County, Florida. So hopefully we'll have, they'll try to describe their system. I'll kind of maybe describe them briefly. But I want to kind of set the stage for this, just talking about the different types of fees, types of credit systems that you can have and how much that varies from one community to another. And I've worked in a lot of different communities. I'm aware there's a lot of differences out there. And so this is kind of an opportunity to sort of bring people together and say, okay, how do different systems work? And, you know, there's pluses and minuses to different systems. And the first thing I'd like to touch on, sorry guys, we're starting a little bit, we started a minute or two early. Not sure if other people are going to be coming or not. So we're just starting the overview though, so you're in plenty of time. And we have plenty of room up front. It's like on Southwest Airlines, they're saying, go back, go back. Plenty of room back here. So basically, I've kind of put, from my experience, we can, I think it's useful to sort of think of this typology of how you can structure a developer credit system. First is eligibility. So what's eligible for credit? So if you had a road impact fee, but it doesn't cover right-of-way costs, maybe you don't have to deal with right-of-way credits, which would be a big one, right? But the flip side of that is you can't use your impact fee for right-of-way. You can't say, okay, we're excluding right-of-way, so you got to give it to us free, but we're going to take the money that people do pay us and we're going to use it to buy right-of-way. So the kind of a, you know, can't have your cake and eat it too. So what improvements are eligible? Got to be a growth-related improvement, obviously, but pretty much anything expanding the capacity of the system could be eligible. Not necessarily is eligible, but could be. So what types of credits? Types of credits are provided. Ownership, who owns the credits, transferability, under what conditions can you transfer credits outside of your development project, and amount, what's the total amount, how's the total amount of the credit determined? All right, so let's talk about eligibility for a minute. So one approach is any capacity improvement. So any capacity improvement that we could conceivably spend impact fee money on. This is typically not done with plan-based fees where you're actually saying we're collecting for these particular projects, these particular improvements, but rather you're saying we're collecting money and we're going to spend it on stuff that's eligible and we haven't identified it all in advance. So any capacity improvement is obviously the most generous approach. only capacity improvements identified in a master plan or a capital improvements plan. Sometimes that varies, you know. It could have, okay, if you're in your long-range plan, if it's in our long-range plan for right-of-way acquisition, then that's eligible. But if it's an actual improvement, it's got to be in our CIP. It's got to be in a shorter-term plan. Then you could say, okay, with either of these, only the excess capacity beyond what is necessary to serve the development. And I've seen this provision in some ordinances, but it seems to me probably not a good practice to try to identify, okay, you're paying a transportation impact fee for arterial improvements. You happen to be on an arterial, you're located next to an arterial, you're going to consume some of the capacity of that arterial. We're only going to give you credit for what's left over that other people can use. But you've got a fee that supposedly covers the cost of the whole system. You should probably be giving credit for the entire amount that the developer has to pay. He's having to pay the impact fee, plus he's having to pay for that improvement. So anyway, so that's eligibility. Then type. What type of credit do they get? Do they get to offset the impact fees in their development? A very common approach. Does the developer get reimbursed directly? So you collect the fees from the builders, then you hand it over to the developer. Sometimes that's the same entity, sometimes it's not. You offset up to the amount due, reimbursement for the excess. That's another possible approach. Often goes with the offset approach. But some communities say, use it on your development or lose it. And is it whether the developer has the option to offset and or reimburse. So, and this kind of plays into the next one, which is ownership, who owns the credit, and actually kind of blurs the line. So I'm not sure this is quite, these aren't exactly exclusive categories. So generally, when you're doing offsets, essentially you're saying the credit runs with the land. So this improvement was made by the developer as a condition, basically, or a necessary requirement for his development, for his subdivision, typically. So the only use you have for it is to offset fees. Then basically, the developer doesn't really get anything back directly. He gets to sell lots that don't have an impact fee, which makes them more affordable to builders perhaps than lots in other subdivisions that don't have the credit. And then reimbursement credits, obviously that's going to be owned by the developer. And then transferability, once again, kind of goes with ownership by the developer, sort of by default. And you can have a mix of ownerships too. You can have, the offset basically runs with the land, but any excess, basically the developer can transfer that credit to a different development. And some allow the developer to use those for other projects in the same district, same benefit district. Some communities allow the reimbursement to be sold to other entities, but typically it is restricted to the service area or benefit district, so you can continue to show that rational nexus. All right, so that kind of gets to most of them. Okay, the final one being amount. So full cost of the improvement, obviously the most generous. Generally, based on estimates. So the developer prepares estimates, the jurisdiction reviews them, And that's, of course, a whole process in itself. How do you decide what the amount is? So full cost is often used. But sometimes the fee is adopted, say, at 50%. Then the jurisdiction says, we're only going to give you 50% credit. I don't know, just from a fairness perspective, I don't like that approach. I mean, I understand it. But from the point of view of, impact fees sort of being leveling the playing field, everybody pays the same, everybody pays their fair share, the development that's being required to make an improvement and getting only partial credit is paying more, sometimes considerably more, than the development that's just paying the discounted fees. So, but that's an approach that some communities use. And so the percentage of the improvement cost equal to the percentage of capacity in excess of what would be used by the development. Again, we get back to that thing that I mentioned earlier about, are you giving credit only for the cost, or are you giving credit for the full cost, or are you discounting that by how much they're going to consume, which supposedly should be covered by the impact fee itself, should cover what they're going to consume in the entire system, including the improvement that's right in front of them they're directly impacting. All right, well, that kind of gives you the idea. And so we have essentially tried to sort of rank or get everybody to sort of describe how their system fits into this typology. And unfortunately, a real interesting case is Washoe County Regional Transportation Commission in Nevada, the Reno area, where they ran into big trouble with credits, with developer credits. And they had a pretty generous credit system. The credits, for one thing, were measured in VMT, vehicle miles of travel. They weren't measured in dollars. So essentially, those credits never lost value. And I don't know if I don't think they had an expiration either. So, you make an improvement 20 years down the road, you still get the value of that improvement, even though in terms of the credit, even though the cost, of course, has gone up a lot in the years, but you're not affected really by the fee schedule anymore. So it might be a fair system. I mean, obviously the improvement that was made was worth a lot more back then. Maybe created a lot of excess capacity, on the other hand, that they didn't need right then. They were going to need in the future. So I guess you could argue that either way. So they ended up changing that. So then now they measure it in dollars. So they don't have that problem anymore. So the problem being they just had all these credits floating around out there that were so numerous that they weren't getting any impact fee revenue. The credits were being transferred, they were widely available. So the credits were owned by the developer, could be sold, and that's still the case. Anywhere within the benefit district, you had to use offsets within the development. So that was a big change. So up to the amount of the fee that would otherwise be due from that development, you only get credit in that development. So you can't transfer those anymore. And they would give credit for the full cost, which could exceed the amount of impact fees owed. And now they restrict it to the cost that's attributable to the development. So the total amount you could get is restricted to, the total amount of credit you could get is restricted to the cost. So I'm not sure that there would be any excess anymore. You've got to use it within the development. So they kind of went from one extreme, very liberal, you could transfer the credits, have an open market, et cetera, to kind of a much more restrictive system, try to rein in the cost to them in terms of revenue of all these credits floating around out there. All right, so that's just kind of try to set the stage, and I'll let the panelists get up here. We'll start with Holly. from the city of Surprise. And let me get yours loaded up here.
Hello. So this is Managing Developer Credits, Issues and Alternatives. I think Clancy asked me to speak more on the issues that we have with dealing with developer credits, and I would never say that we are the poster child for best practice on how we're doing that, so feel free to not take notes. We just want you to know what we do and how we administer them, and it's complicated, and kind of go into that. And first, we'll give you an overview of Surprise. So Surprise, Arizona we're part of the Phoenix metropolitan area. We're the little red area right there. We have about 130,000 people. Median household income is about 60,000. We were the fastest growing city in Arizona in 2016. And we had a rapid growth rate in the 2000s. So we grew 100,000 people in 10 years. So quite the extreme growth. So we saw the boom, and now we saw the recession. So we've been on both sides, the peaks and valleys. So Surprise is 108 square miles of land area, but our planning area is 309 square miles. Most of our development is here in SPA 1. So our SPA 1 is a special planning area. So the outskirts is relatively not developed at all. So most of our 130,000 people live in SPA 1 or SPA 2. So, and that majority is in the purple area down here. So a little bit of history of our impact fees, and I'm using the SPA 2 specifically because that's where we're going to see our next amount of growth happen. Just going back from our 2004, 2006, our impact fees were pretty minimal, and then as growth grew, we started growing with our impact fees and started charging more. So we have fire, general government, library, parks, police, we had public works, road, and then our utilities. Going through there, Arizona had an impact fee legislation change, very significant. The home builders lobbied and got a Senate bill passed where you can see the substantial decrease. So there was increase and then there was a decrease. So we are no longer allowed to charge public works impact fees. Libraries became so constringent that we're no longer charging those. Parks, we used to be able to charge lots for parks or vehicles, things like that. Now we can only have a 25-acre park or less in order for it to count for an impact fee. So there's a lot of constraint that's been put on Arizona that we've had to quickly figure out a way to be in compliance with the law. And I think that when we took it very literal, and I think most of Arizona can agree with me that we did the extreme. All right, we're just not going to have any impact fees, so we're kind of stuck with the building, but building had ceased a little bit. So we're redoing our impact fee study right now, but that's kind of what makes us, I don't know if it's unique or not, but we have about 80 development agreements with developers from the 1990s to current. So some of them have been retired. They were also in that heyday. Some of them are dormant. Some of them have expired. Some of them have been reworked. So that's kind of the situation that we're in, and that will go into a lot of the credit issues that we have and the developing credits and things like that. So, and we have one community facilities district, just so you guys are aware. So anything in our development agreements was basically, they put in that you're going to reimburse for a water system. We're going to build the water supply facility, and you guys will reimburse us with credits. Or we're going to donate 3 acres of fire station land. In return, we're going to pay you with fire impact fees and reimbursement for that land. Wastewater facilities, we have 2 joint, I guess I wouldn't say joint, collaborative wastewater treatment plants that several of the builders and developers got together and built the treatment plant, but now we just credit them on EDUs, and we have to track the EDUs. So some of the things that are in our development agreements are very specific on why we reimburse. So, and it's inherited language. We didn't write it. It's just we're honoring what we inherited, and some of them, if you opened them, you just close them. You're like, I don't ever want to look at that again, but I have to administer them. So brings us to payback types. So kind of what I had said is, per these development agreements, we credit developers. We also have payback agreements where we reimburse developers. we also have payback agreements where we credit and reimburse developers. And we can credit you for fire station land, and then we can track your wastewater EDUs, but then you put in a well, so then we're gonna reimburse you for the well, and then you built part of a park, so we're gonna reimburse you for part of a park with 50%, but another developer over here also put in a park, so your 50 became 25%, so I'm really good at spreadsheets. We also have land that is on-site and off-site, so for example, we have a park developer who put in a park, and per their development agreement, they are reimbursed the entire special planning area's park impact fees. But ours is only the park component of the park impact fee, so it's not all of it, and that's only until developer B puts in their park, and then they get a percentage of the share. So, simple? So eligibility it's a capacity improvement, and we're really stuck in these development agreements. So if it was in the development agreement, that's what we're legally bound to. It's a contract, so that's what we're gonna credit you for. If they're in the infrastructure improvement plans, of course, an example is the dedication of land. So really what's written in the development agreements is kind of what we credit. So determining the amount, a lot of it is in the agreement of what we had said, and it's not a set amount, it's whatever lawyer wrote it at the time that either it was our attorney or their attorney agreed to. So we have fire station lands that are 90,000 an acre, we have some that are 100,000 an acre, so it's not consistent. So making sure that we reimburse those, and it's the cost of infrastructure. So it's the cost of infrastructure at the time that they built it. They have to submit all their costs to engineering. Engineering goes through and reviews it, and then finance takes a look at it. We have to make sure that if needed, it was publicly bid and it followed the procurement process, and whatever their stipulation is, then it goes to council on that approved amount, and that is the amount that we are set to reimburse with the impact fees. So, simple. We also know if there's a known obligation, so we have a liability coming up in our books, that we are going to segregate that money in the account, knowing that it hasn't been built yet or it hasn't been dedicated to the city. We're still going to put that money aside if it's an off-site reimbursement where other people are collecting. So once we get that infrastructure, we can turn the money over to them that they're owed. So issues. I don't know if you see any issues with anything that I've said to date. Tracking. It's a tracking nightmare. We have to track each individual projects. We do have a database, we do have software for our permitting software, but we also have to track the obligations and the segregated account and how much money is in there and their impact fees, so they're restricted. So it's a lot of my time is spent tracking. We try to track them with project strings. So anything in our general ledger, we put an impact fee project string. So if it's a well, this is this project. All our accounts are in here, all the money going in, all the money going out are tracked in this process. And then we also now have a contract database. So we go through and we put the contract in, but we can also tie the financials to it. But that's been in the last year. So it's not, it doesn't give you the complete history of everything that we've done, but it's getting better, and every time we find a process improvement, we definitely are all over it. Reconciling, as you can imagine, having all of those agreements going on at once, reconciling isn't always easy. And then with our legislation, we have to have an audit process separate just for impact fees that's posted. And that goes to council, so we have to make sure for the auditing purposes, just for general accounting purposes too, that we know where every dollar is gone, what reimbursement it's gone to, what our obligations at, what we've met so far, how much more we have left, and then we also have to make sure we have that information to give to our impact fee consultant when they come on, so they know our debt schedule and our obligations, and to make sure we factor those into our ongoing impact fees. So change in statute, which I had mentioned before, that's been great for Surprise in all of Arizona. But updating fees too is making sure we have all of that. Communication is huge because in finance, we do all of the tracking. Community development does all the implementation of the fees. So when somebody comes in and asks for a permit, they're the ones who give them the permit and have to calculate those fees. So making sure that hey, these fees go into effect on September 15th. We need to make sure that the software is updated and this credit is good on this developer. And there's several different, like I had said, there's 80 different neighborhoods that have different development agreements. So we have to make sure that each one is tracked and accounted for. So when they go through the permitting process, they're charged the correct amount. So then we don't have to in turn do a refund, which we're not talking about right now. And external communication too, making sure that anytime we do an update, we're talking to other developers and making sure that they know you're a stakeholder in this. We know that this is going to impact you. Your fees are going to go up. Another really fun thing that came out of the legislation of this is that there's a 2-year waiting period. So if you have an active community with development fees, even if we change our fees tomorrow, if they're currently in this development agreement and they're currently pulling permits, the old fees are in effect for 2 years. So even if we change our fees tomorrow, we have to track the old fees for this development for 2 more years. So then we'll have 2 sets of fees going on at the same time, which is great. And then just making sure that our council is up to date and we're communicating with them too. I know impact fees are, at least where we live, are a hot topic right now because we live in a city that doesn't want to raise taxes, and we are starting to boom. I mean, we went from 7,000 permits and now we're at 500, so we're really going back up. So we need to go back into development, but we are seeing a huge increase in permit growth in that. So I think in the downturn we were at about 300. So we're getting better every year, but hopefully we're never back at 7,000 permits a year. It's a little insane. And then the allocation, like I had said about the fees of the different development agreements. If there's 2 parks in a development, first you have to break down the impact fee from what we have done and then separate the 2 out and make sure that they both get the share and then make sure that they're both going to get repaid over time. So again, not the poster child for best practice, but this is why Clancy brought us here. With probably this slide alone is, how do you do this? It takes a lot of work. So the future of our development agreements is, of course, we're going to honor what we inherited and make sure that we are sticking to the compliance of those contracts. We want to make sure that we do not put ourselves in this situation again. So any development agreement that comes forward, they pay for their own infrastructure. We're not doing reimbursements per an agreement that puts us tied into that, contractually obligating us to do that. And something new that's coming in is some of the developers are trying to do buy-in agreements. So that's something up and coming that we're going to have to work with the impact fees and buy-in agreements and how that all works logistically. So sure there's no questions. It's pretty simple. So just turn it over to the next one, Clancy, or do you guys have any specific questions?
Let's save the Q&A for the end.
Perfect.
And if people can just like make notes and try to save your questions for the end.
I don't know where you are. There?
Somewhere.
I think you're up.
Thank you. It's always great to come to these kinds of conferences and see how easy my job actually is. Holly, thanks, appreciate that. My name is Chris Dawson. I am a transportation planner at Alachua County. I'm sort of a last minute to this conference. Jeff was supposed to be presenting for me, my boss. He's the impact fee administrator. We work hand in hand on all this, so I'm fairly certain I have most of the knowledge, and I know I have, as I said earlier, more hair than he does. So hopefully we can get some good information to y'all. At Alachua County, we have 4 separate impact fees that we administer. We have a parks and a fire, which are fairly, and a transportation impact fee. They're fairly traditional types of impact fees. We also have a multimodal transportation mitigation, which is closer to a mobility fee that allows us to spend funds on things like transit capital and operations. We also spend money from that on standalone bicycle and pedestrian projects. So 4 different fees. We generally don't have to worry about credits with our parks and fire impact fees. We haven't had anybody who's donated land or built parks or anything like that in Alachua County. But both with our transportation and our MMTM, we have creditable projects that developers have taken advantage of. A huge part of that is that we have an identified capital improvements plan within our comprehensive plan, so adopted by ordinance. And it identifies specific projects that we can expend MMTM and transportation impact fee dollars on. So these are almost all programmed projects. They're within our CIP. It's a long-range CIP, so we have a 5-year CIP, but our adopted CIP is actually a 30-year. So that allows us to look at projects that might not get constructed within the 5-year, but may need, for example, right-of-way longer out. So this is sort of the basis of where we can issue credits, where we can deal with credits. If it's not in the plan, we don't have a way to issue you credit for it, basically. And the other part of that is sort of looking at these as part of our comprehensive plan, looking at where we anticipate having larger, higher intensity, density projects along those corridors that would be able to participate in either donating land or building facilities. So that's sort of the tie between a land use and a transportation component that we're really trying to pick up on the individual developments ahead of time that may have the ability to provide for some creditable projects. So I think as we've looked at credits in Alachua County, and we don't have we're not a super high growth rate area, but we do have infrastructure that we've identified. And so part of what we've sort of taken on ourselves is to work with developers to identify what projects can be creditable and how much of them are. That's not always explicitly spelled out, and I was listening with some interest to Clancy's portion of that because we've done different kinds of projects in different ways. So as an example, we've had projects where we've determined a developer's shared portion, how much of that project they are using. They build it, we pay for part, and give them credit for the other part. So we've had that. We've had examples where we're reimbursing or crediting, not super simple, but using basically tax increment districts managed through a developer's agreement, where we provide a fund where a developer can be reimbursed, but they also get credit for projects that they're constructing. So it kind of works both ways. And an example of that actually is if any of you have been to Gainesville, Florida, this is Interstate 75, and this is a bridge that one of our developers constructed. It's a 4-lane with a dedicated transit lane, bike path or bike lanes, and a multi-use path as well. So it's about a 120-foot section. It was a $19 million project that one of our developers constructed. And that's way over and above whatever sort of mitigation they might have. So we actually are funding that, the sort of above their mitigation portion, with a transportation improvement district, which is essentially a tax increment district. So it's kind of tying together our impact fees, which are paying for a portion of that basically, but also a tax increment district to pay for the additional infrastructure. Any projects that we do credit, we're always reviewing. Our big one normally is right-of-way. When we're getting right-of-way, that's going through our surveyor's office to review appraisals. And then any projects that are constructed, obviously, are going through our engineering department. So again, when we're determining the costs, we have a couple of different ways that we can do things. So for small projects, we don't require you to get an appraisal. If you're dedicating right-of-way, just an example, you can actually, we'll let you take the property appraiser's value for your land. We allow for a 30% addition factor because our property appraiser pretty reliably underappraises property. So we kind of allow that as a simple thing for somebody who's donating a small piece. For other projects that are larger, we require an appraisal, and then we can reimburse or give credit for that right-of-way. We're typically not buying right-of-way at this point from people. We're trying not to buy right-of-way from people. And again, all of that, those costs then that go along with an individual project are going to come from an engineer's estimate is really the best case. And as of now, we basically write all of those into a developer's agreement. So our multimodal transportation mitigation requires a developer's agreement with every developer. And in that agreement, we actually itemize the credit for each of those projects. So whether it's a piece of right-of-way or it's an actual physical improvement, the cost of that project is determined in the developer's agreement so that everybody knows what that cost is up front, rather than having to wait until something is constructed and then being short money, basically. In Alachua County, our credits with our MMTM program, they're owned by whoever makes the improvement, whether that's somebody who's donating the right-of-way, which might be a property owner prior to development. If there's an actual physical improvement made, it's by whoever the developer is. And again, we have individual agreements with each of the property owners. Those credits that come along with those, they belong to the developer. They can be transferred outside of the project. They can only be transferred within the same mobility district. So we have 3 mobility districts. So the developer could take those, and on another project that they own, they can transfer those credits to that, only to the same, they hold them, they can't sell them. So they can't give them to another entity, for example. And in order to use the credits on a particular project, they have to that entity has to specifically authorize the credit to be applied to a project. So whether that's at a specific building permit or transferred to another project, we have to have a specific letter from them that says we authorize use on that building permit. So even where we have projects where we know every single unit in there has a credit on it, we still require that developer to give us a letter every time. And that sounds kind of silly, but for us, for tracking purposes, it's important because we're sort of getting their affirmative that yes, we're gonna fund that. As for tracking, this is something that we're trying to consistently get better at so we don't get worse. As I mentioned, we have the project that constructed that bridge. That's about a $19 million improvement. And we anticipate that they'll have about 40 to 50 users who would be looking at using credit from that. So it's increasingly important that we kind of track each of those users to identify where those credits are being applied to. The other part of that is they have that $19 million credit, but they also have a way to get reimbursed. So we're having to make sure that they're not getting more money back, either in terms of credits towards their project, which is their mitigation, or towards cash back from the project. That's through that Transportation Improvement District. Today, we use basically just a spreadsheet that we created, and it identifies whether they've made a credit, what kind of project they've done. So if they've physically done a project, an intersection improvement, built a road, something like that. If they've donated right-of-way, and we even are to the point where we're tracking credits that would be from previous uses within that same spreadsheet. And then we look at how they're utilizing those by individual building permit. And we sort of have an advantage since we're the administrators and we work one floor above our building department. We review all of our impact fees that are quoted out at the time of building permit. We have an advantage in that we can work individually with clerks and we can review those pretty quickly. But it's still one of those jobs that just ends up falling to Excel. It's really good at it. So that's all I have, and I hope that we have some questions later. Interested to hear them.
Hello, good afternoon. My name is David Goldstein. I am the Chief Assistant County Attorney for Pasco County. I think I'm the only lawyer on the panel, so please don't hold that against me. I tend to have a little more of a legal bent towards my presentation. I don't have as many graphics, obviously. But let me kind of tell you where Pasco County is. Pasco County, we're in the room we're in right now is basically the southern part of the Tampa Bay area. Pasco County is generally considered the northern top hat to the Tampa Bay area. So we're a bedroom community to Tampa, St. Petersburg. We have a lot of growth because as St. Petersburg builds out, as Hillsborough County builds out, a lot of that growth is moving north into the south. And so we see a lot of that growth. We have a lot of impact fees. We have some of the highest impact fees in the state of Florida. And so we have a lot of issues that arise, a lot of gray areas that arise in the issue of developer credits. We issue a lot of developer credits. And so I'm going to try to cover those issues and then how we resolved each of those issues. So Pasco, like a lot of other impact fees, has multiple fees. These are all fees that we have: schools, utilities, transportation, mobility, public safety, parks and recreation. Each one of those fees has individual components to it. So example, schools has a land component, a building component. School buses are a component of the school fee. Our transportation, our mobility fee has a transit component. It has a bike ped component. It has a roadway component. So with every one of these fees, we had to make a decision when we issue a developer credit. Are we going to give them credit against that entire fee, or are we going to give them credit against those individual components? And that's been a recurring debate in Pasco County, and it's an issue that we really struggled with. And so I'm going to kind of tell you how we resolved that. There are some benefits to giving credit against the entire fee. Obviously, from an accounting perspective, it's easier if you just have one fee that you're giving credit against. It gives the local government and the developer some flexibility, and they can spend that money where it's most needed. And sometimes the developer is more likely to provide the facility if they know they're getting credit against the entire fee. There's some downsides though, because if you're giving credit against the entire fee, and I'll give you an example of schools. Okay, so if a developer donates land for a school site, and you give that developer credit against the entire school impact fee, then you may never accumulate enough money for the buildings or the buses, and so that becomes an issue. And you may have a master plan that said you were going to do so many buses or so many school buildings, and then you never actually achieve what's in your master plan because you've given the developers too many credits for the land. So that became an issue in Pasco because we had a lot of school sites, a lot of park sites, fire sites, but we had no money to put the buildings on. So we moved to a system where we started giving credit against the individual components. And there's some benefits to that. One is it ensures that you're going to collect enough funds for each of those components. My opinion, it gives you more consistency with your facility's master plan because you're making sure that you're actually going to deliver what's in your plan. Because if you have land, if you have buildings and you have buses, you're making sure you're delivering all of those facilities. And also, we've discovered that it prevents the developer from just saying, I'm going to give you some land and that meets my obligation. Because that's usually the cheaper thing for the developer to provide is the land and not the buildings. And so for that reason, we only give credit against the land component. It is more complex to do it that way, I will admit. It is a bigger administrative burden because when they come to the permit counter and they're only getting credit against the land part of our fee, that means we're still collecting the remainder of that fee. And so that becomes an administrative burden for our permitting people. But we do feel that for the reasons I mentioned, that it still helps us from a capital delivery perspective. Now, the second issues that I have listed here in terms of less flexibility for expenditures and it takes longer to accumulate the funds, those can be issues when you separate a fee into its components. The way we tried to address that issue is we allow lending between the components. So the land fund can lend money to the facility fund, or the bus fund can lend money to the land fund, depending on what our needs are. But we ultimately require those individual components to be paid back over time so that we deliver each of the components. So I'm going to shift gears a little bit to transferability because this is another issue that we've kind of struggled with in Pasco. And this is where you sort of have to play economist, when you're how do you deal with the transferability credits, because you can create this whole secondary credit market. And if you're not careful, if you allow too much transferability, it actually can have the effect of devaluing credits. And I've heard some of the developers in Pasco say that they actually appreciate the fact that we restrict transferability, because in some of the counties to our south, they're less restrictive, but it's actually devalued their credits. And so the developers are actually less likely to build projects in those counties because their credits are devalued and they don't want to do it. If the credit has no value, why are you going to build a project? But then, the other issue you have on the counter to that is if you don't allow some transferability, you could have a project where the cost of what they're building exceeds the amount that they're going to consume in their project. And so what do they do with that excess? So we tried to strike a middle ground in Pasco and said, look, you can transfer those credits, all right, within your development, you can transfer it all you want, but you can't transfer it outside of your development until your project's basically built out, because we're trying to protect that market. We're trying to protect that credit market. So it seems to be working. We still have developers that are actively trying to build projects for credits. It has a value to them. But we do allow them, once their project's built out, to sell those credits outside of the project, because otherwise they can't. We basically issue them a worthless credit because they can't take advantage of that credit. One dilemma that you have, though, is especially in a large project, or with the economic issues we had recently, is in terms of ownership. So, if you're going to allow transferability, you got to be clear who owns that credit. We had an issue recently in Pasco County where a project had some utility credits, and the project went into bankruptcy. Just before the bankruptcy was final, they transferred those credits to another entity. And so and then somebody else took the property in the bankruptcy. So we had the entity that took the property in the bankruptcy, and then we had the entity that received the written assignment of the credits. They were both claiming they were entitled to those credits. So that creates a dilemma. And in that particular case, we actually are filing, and this is for I don't know if there's any lawyers in the room, but we filed what's called an interpleader action. An interpleader action means that you file an action in the court and you say, we don't know who gets these credits. We're not sure, but court, you figure it out. You two fight it out. We have the credits here, and we're willing to issue them to whoever fights it out and wins. So we had to do that in that case, and you want to try to avoid that situation if at all possible. In terms of determining the amount, some of the issues that we deal with in Pasco, and I think Chris kind of mentioned this, we try to, with any improvement, particularly roadway improvements, we try to figure out what part of that improvement is what site-related. In other words, it's needed for that particular developer's impacts versus what's more needed for the public. And that's frequently an issue with intersection improvements, because at an intersection, some of the turning movements directly benefit that developer. Some of the turning movements might actually be more for the benefit of the public, and so we have to parse out what part of that improvement is for the developer versus for the public. Or if you have a landlocked piece of property, we talked, Clancy talked about roadways that sort of are on the boundary of your development, but what if the roadway they're building goes right through the development, and it's a landlocked piece of land? It's hard to say that that entire roadway is for the benefit of the public because it's unlocking their land as well. So we take the position that the first 2 lanes of that roadway are for the benefit of that developer and unlocking that development, and that any additional lanes would be for the benefit of the public. That's a general rule of thumb, though, and if they do a traffic analysis, we could sometimes deviate from that, but that's our general rule of thumb. Another issue that arises when you do these development agreements is, do you make the developer competitively bid the improvement? These are, to a certain extent, county or municipal funds that they're dealing with, and so in Pasco, we do require that the developer competitively bid the project. We want to make sure that even though we're giving it to them as a credit project, that we're getting the best price. So there are some jurisdictions that don't require competitive bidding. We do in Pasco, at least as it relates to construction. For design, that's a little more difficult because it's harder to competitively bid design, but we cap the amount of the design that we'll reimburse. Our general goal is we don't want to pay more for an improvement through a credit process than we would pay if we were building the improvement ourselves. And so we're trying to make sure that when we put in caps or competitive bidding, we're trying to control costs. There's lots of other issues that can arise. If they have a construction manager, do you give them credit for those costs? If they have to bond the project, do you give credit for those costs? If there's insurance, legal expenses, utility relocations, if they're commingling the ponds, these are all issues that can arise in a credit scenario. I can tell you that at least in Pasco, We do give credit for construction management, but we cap the amount. We give credit for bonding insurance, but we cap the amount. We do not give credit for legal expenses. I'm a lawyer, and we still don't give credit for legal expenses. Utility relocations, we don't give credit for because the law in Florida is that the utility provider is required to move those utilities at their expense. And so we will not give credit for the relocation of a utility for a roadway project. And we do not give credit for commingled retention ponds because our position is that that pond is really serving the developer too, and so they shouldn't be entitled to credit for the pond. In terms of any costs that might exceed the estimate or what's in our CIP, we do require that the improvement be in our CIP. If it does exceed the cost that's estimated in our CIP, we will give credit for that. Because we view it as like any other county road project. We have some projects that are more expensive than what we budgeted, and so we still will give full credit if it exceeds the estimate. And then there's the issue of when do you issue the credits? At least in Pasco, for design expenses, we give credit as soon as that design is complete, or the permitting is complete. But we won't give credit for the construction until the entire project is complete and we've accepted it for construction. There are other jurisdictions that will give progress payments. As the developer's building, they'll give payments, but we generally make sure that it's a project that we're willing to accept and it's open to the public before we give those credits. Some ownership issues that can arise, and some of these are, kind of legal issues. Sometimes the developer is building the improvement themselves, and then sometimes they're having their HOA or their community development district build the improvement for them. And so then the issue arises, if a community development district or HOA builds the improvement or finances that improvement, do you give the credit to the developer or do you give the credit to the HOA and CDD? We take the position that the credit needs to be given to the CDD and HOA, particularly for CDDs. That's a separate local government entity, and our position is that the credit should be issued to the entity that financed that improvement, and if they want to sell those credits back to the developer, that's up to the CDD. But there's those CDDs and HOAs levy assessments sometimes on the residents for these improvements. We want to make sure they're getting the full benefit of the assessments they've levied. And so we think they should be able to sell those credits back to the developer, and so for that reason, we issue the credits to the CDD or the HOA. But you're still going to have circumstances where you have competing parties trying, saying I should get the credit or I should get the credit. You might have a master developer, and then you might have an individual builder, and they may be sort of jointly participating in the project, and you don't know who to issue the credits to. What we typically do in our development agreements is if it's unclear who's entitled to the credit, we will generally, whoever we're issuing that credit to, we will get an indemnification from that entity saying if anybody else claims the right to this credit, we want you to indemnify us, because we don't want to get sued by this other party that may have a claim to that credit. So I think it's a good practice. Something you might want to consider in your development agreements is if you're issuing a credit to somebody and there's somebody else that might be entitled to it, try to get indemnification from the party that you issued that credit to. Last issue I have here is how do you document credits? And I think Chris and Holly kind of talked a little bit about this, but we have the developer issue credit letters. We don't issue any kind of certificate for credits. We just have them issue credit. We create a credit account, and then the developer can issue credit letters to assign those credits to individual builders in their project, and then we deduct that amount from the credit account. We do have some ability for reimbursement. It's kind of limited. We only reimburse any fees they've already paid in the project. It will reimburse back to them as opposed to issuing it as a credit. And so that's kind of how we handle the reimbursement and credit scenario. That's the end of my presentation, and I guess at this point, do you want to come back up here, Clancy, and we'll take questions?
Yeah, I think we can turn off the PowerPoint. So, got any questions for our panel?
About the relationship of your land development code, like subdividing and having to donate right away because of subdivision versus zoning and land use, and how you've kind of coordinated that. And I think you also have coordinated this with your corridor preservation plan in terms of how the credit works. So you might just want to talk about it. I think you've done a good job of the code and some of those and its relationship to credits.
Yeah, so, yeah, and I have a whole presentation I'm going to do tomorrow on our mobility fee system, but We generally we have a mobility fee system that uses other revenue sources to kind of subsidize some fees in Pasco County. And so we take the position that that there's a maximum fee that we could have charged, and we calculate what that is for our mobility fee. And then there's the fee that we actually charge, and a lot of that is subsidized by other taxpayer revenue. We take the position that right away that we exact, basically for free, as long as it doesn't exceed that, when you combine the fee with the dollar amount of the right of way we exact, as long as it doesn't exceed that maximum mobility fee, that we can exact up to that amount. If it exceeds that amount, we either don't exact it, or we give them credit for that difference. So because there are some of our fees in Pasco that we subsidize so much, like office, it's zero. Okay, we intentionally bought the fee down to zero. So if we exacted right away from an office development, we would probably be able to exact a lot of right away without hitting that cap because we bought down their fee to zero. Does that kind of answer your question?
And how much you require the first 2 lanes, and if you're subdividing, you don't give credit?
Right, we don't give credit for the first 2 lanes. There may be some rare exceptions, but as a general rule, we don't, our position is that if it's the first 2 lanes and in a vacant tract of land that's needed to basically unlock that development, that is not creditable because you couldn't develop the land without those first 2 lanes. That's our position.
More questions? Anybody else?
Holly, could you just briefly explain the buy-in agreement? That was a term I'm not familiar with. So it was sort of something new coming.
I will try. So we have a large development that's coming in that used to be, the way it was structured was a heavy buy-in reimbursement where they're putting in probably $50 million worth of infrastructure or above that with roads and creating a water system. They're basically building in vacant land at this point. Like it's empty, it's raw land, so they're putting in, just building a mini city, essentially. So for all of their improvements that they're doing, they want the developers that are going to benefit, future developers that are going to benefit from their water infrastructure because they won't have to put in a well because they're going to increase capacity to tie in. Yeah, they're oversizing, exactly. Same with putting in a roadway that is beneficial because it goes through an area where we don't have a corridor that goes to the east. So again, it's benefiting the community, so they're going to put in a buy-in agreement, and they have it structured to where community development will hold plat until those funds are paid from one developer to the other. Conveniently, and surprise, we have one lawyer that represents a multitude of these developers, so it seems to be copacetic with them. So I think they're all aware of it, but it is something new that we haven't done before. So how impact fees relate to that is something, a bridge we haven't crossed yet because they're still about 2 years away from permitting, but we know that it's coming and trying to just get a handle on how we're going to administer the impact fees in relation to the buy-in fees that they're also putting in is another administrative nightmare that we're going to have to figure out. But does that help? Okay.
All right.
Holly.
Hi.
Just, I guess, maybe a question with maybe a couple examples within the city.
Mm-hmm.
So, as you talked about, there was a really high growth period, late 90s through when the housing market bottomed out. And there were, the planning area 1, the kind of central part of the city, and development there, as well as development starting in that planning area 2 that was, open desert essentially. So I'm just curious, with, history and looking back at everything that's happened, how did the concept of development being risky in situations where, say, in that older planning area, the last tap or the last development fee theoretically could be sold, and there may be a developer that has a credit or reimbursement balance that they're just not going to see? And secondarily, with the high growth period in sort of the mid-2000s when development housing prices in Arizona, you couldn't essentially build fast enough. And so developers did upfront and build a lot of infrastructure in that planning 2 area, and then are maybe waiting 10, 15, 20 years to be reimbursed and credited as growth picks back up. So I'm just curious in terms of the concept that, you know, it's risky. You may not get reimbursed, or you're going to get reimbursed over maybe a lot longer period than what the developers were thinking in 2006 when they agreed to put in wastewater plants and all this infrastructure. How is that, you know, has that gone with development, with city council, with kind of city staff? Has that concept been well received, not well received? And just curious about that.
Well, it's not well received because the developers already put in the infrastructure and they're not getting made whole fast enough. So they've sunk costs essentially until that. So I think that we've had some developers fold, some that mothballed some of their projects so they didn't get turned over to the city. So again, we've anticipated this infrastructure coming for 10 years, but we still haven't, it hasn't been turned over to the city. And then also with our impact fees, if you saw that we doubled our impact fees during the heyday, and I think a lot of those development agreements were written with those fees in mind. And then with the legislation that came out in 2012, we cut them in half. So not only is the time period that they're going to get reimbursed for extended, but also the financial contribution that we can contribute per permit is also decreasing. So I would say it hasn't been well received, but essentially there's nothing we can do or they can do because that's the agreement that they have that we're honoring. We had a developer that they put in water infrastructure and their agreement expired, but since they had submitted the infrastructure, we accepted it. Per state law, we have to continue to reimburse them even though their development agreement has expired. So that was a new one, a lawsuit we avoided but potentially was coming our way. So I think they put in $6 million worth of water system improvements. We had reimbursed $3 million. They are 29% built, so we'll continue to pay them back until they're made whole, even though our agreement's expired. So does that answer your question?
It does, and I didn't expect it to be like a, resolved answer, maybe kind of an ongoing thing.
Yeah.
Just with the legislation changes as well, that had an impact. Those agreements were executed before and now.
Yeah, and they all have. And it's interesting because it was the Home Builders Association that lobbied for the legislation, but when the home builders are also developers, that they don't like the law, we didn't lobby for it. Like, our hands are tied and you tied them, like, essentially. So, yeah, they have to know that, though. They have to own it, because that's, whether they lobbied for it or not, that's the situation we're in. So I think they can at least respect the situation, maybe not agree with it.
Who else? Doesn't have to be on the first row.
But they have to pay attention.
Yeah.